Hi, my name is Eliza Walsh, and for the past semester, I've been studying successional dynamics within the Tom Jones Commons. I'm interested in land management, so when a new park opened in my neighborhood, I was curious about the ecological methods that were used in the project design. The recent construction of this park presented the perfect opportunity to study a topic I've learned a lot about in my ecology class: community succession. Succession, or the change in species over time, starts after a disturbance, such as reconstruction in this case. The Tom Jones Commons opened and included two areas, a pocket wetland and a meadow, so I chose to compare succession of the vegetative species in these two locations. There is plenty of current research that has covered parks, wetlands, and meadows, but there is a lack of research when it comes to succession and wetlands inside city parks. The purpose of the pocket wetland in this case was to boost biodiversity in the whole of Eden Park. This idea of an urban wetland in a park represents a very niche and understudied area. Combining this with succession, I felt my study truly had something valuable to contribute. My rationale for this project stems from the fact that human intervention on wildlife is unpredictable. Redesigning and implementing a new habitat can have unintended consequences, and the level of success will vary with each time. I wanted to provide valuable feedback to Cincinnati parks looking at the progress of these areas. My study sought to answer three questions. Did the plans from the seed mixes establish? Do the pocket wetland and the meadow communities differ? And are these communities in the midst of succession? My field site was the Tom Jones Commons, where I collected data over a 12-week period. I established a 10-meter transect line in both the wetland and the meadow and collected data from inside 10 quadrats along each line. For biodiversity, I used three values, all stemming from the Shannon-Weiner equation. I used the biodiversity index, the species richness, and species evenness. For my statistical tests, I used a two-tailed t-test for two samples, assuming equal or unequal variance depending on the dataset. For my first question, did the plants from the seed mixes appear? I came to the conclusion from my results that no, none of the plants appeared, but a wide variety of other grasses and weeds did. As for what plants did actually appear, this chart represents all of the different vegetative species and in what proportions they appeared in the population at the wetland location. The wetland habitat was dominated by weed species like hairy bittercress, yellow rocket, American speedwell, and Byram moss. These species are all among the first pioneer species to arrive to an area after a severe disturbance. This chart represents the distribution of the meadow species. The vegetation here was dominated by grasses, forbs, and weeds. Chickweed, bluegrass, Korean longgrass, clover, and dandelions made frequent appearances. This community underwent less of a disturbance during construction and didn't flood regularly like the wetland, so I believe this is why succession here appears to be slightly further along. This community is much closer to what the eventual climax community of a meadow should look like. To answer my second question, how did conditions at the pocket wetland and the meadow differ? I came to the conclusion that the soil conditions demonstrated no significant difference, and that biodiversity values also demonstrated no significant difference. The percentage of ground cover, however, did see a significant difference. The pocket wetland consistently had much less vegetative ground cover than in the shortgrass meadow. The wetland started out with much less ground cover at about 15% and only ever reached about 35%, whereas the meadow started around 30 but eventually increased to almost 100% full vegetative cover. Once again, I attribute this difference to the frequent flooding of the wetland, which disturbed the community and seemed to be washing out plants or covering them with mud. These pictures were taken on the last day of observation and demonstrate the difference between the two areas effectively. The meadow on the left looks lush, full, and green, whereas vegetation in the wetland is still pretty sparse. To answer my third question, are these communities in the midst of succession, my results indicated that yes, biodiversity and species composition changed over time in both locations. There was a strong correlation between time and biodiversity at both locations. Here I graphed a linear correlation indicating that succession is indeed underway. Further evidence that succession is underway at these locations is actually in the weed communities that have begun to colonize. In secondary succession, weeds are usually the first vegetative species to arrive, as they have evolved to adapt to conditions that other species simply cannot tolerate. There is a significant amount of research that demonstrates how important weeds are during early succession, since they are able to survive and proliferate through repeated disturbances. My recommendations to Cincinnati parks are first and foremost to prevent flooding in any future projects. Frequent flooding has been shown to reduce biodiversity and biomass and make it very difficult for seeds to establish. Flooding at this site could be alleviated by adjusting the elevation levels of the wetland shore and also by installing more drainage leading out of the wetland. When it comes to seed distribution, I believe one of the main problems here was actually the season of planting. The project manager of the Tom Jones Commons told me that the seeds were distributed in late July and early August due to time constraints and budgetary constraints. The current research indicates that the best time for seed distribution is in the early spring or late fall. So by seeding during either one of these seasons, providing more vegetation to fortify the banks and prevent erosion, and also by choosing flood-resistant seed types, I believe there would be an increased success when it comes to planting up city park projects. Additional steps such as using a cover crop over the winter or increasing soil to seed density could also help the seeds establish. In conclusion, I believe that my study contributed to an understudied and important subject area, succession in city parks. Although there were insignificant differences in biodiversity and soil conditions, there was a major significant difference in the lack of ground cover in the wetland habitat. Although none of the plants from the seed mixtures established, the results of this study did indicate that succession is underway. Further research should continue to focus on city parks as they are invaluable sources to both human communities and to local wildlife. As with my last study, I intend to send the results of this study to my contacts at Cincinnati Parks with hope that the recommendations will be considered in future projects. That is the end of my study and my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.